It happened so fast. 1 second I was just trying to find my favorite hoodie, and the next second, the air in my bedroom turned to ice, and my older brother Mark was standing in the doorway, not just looking at me, but looming. His shadow stretched across the floor like a dark, suffocating blanket, and the look in his eyes, that wasn't my brother anymore. That was something colder, something predatory. He didn't even raise his voice at first. It was the quiet that got me. He just said, his voice low, almost a hiss, "You move one more thing in this room without my say-so, and I promise you, you're going to learn exactly what a broken jaw feels like. I will rearrange your face until you can't recognize yourself in the mirror, and I will make sure every single one of your teeth ends up somewhere down your throat." That was the threat. Raw, visceral, and utterly terrifying. Because it wasn't the first time he'd said something like this, but this time, the sincerity was palpable. It hung there in the stale air between us, heavy enough to choke on. Think about that for a second. Living in your own home, in the one place you should be safe, and having a family member promise to inflict violence so severe it's literally life-threatening. What do you do when the person who swore to protect you becomes the very source of your deepest fear? And what happens when the people who are supposed to intervene, mom and dad, are paralyzed by the same monster? Because that's where we were, deep in the trenches of fear with no official support, just the chilling realization that my safety, my very body, was now entirely contingent on obeying the unpredictable whims of my volatile older brother. I froze, the hoodie forgotten. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. I didn't know how to breathe normally anymore. Every inhale felt shallow, stolen. You see, Mark had always been difficult. A normal temper, sure, the usual teenage rebellion, but over the last year it had curdled into something truly toxic. It wasn't just about borrowed items anymore. It was control. Absolute, suffocating control. He had weaponized his own aggression, and we were all just living in the blast radius. My bedroom, my sanctuary, had transformed into a cage. The door, which I used to leave slightly ajar, was now always locked. But even that felt pointless. Mark didn't knock. He simply used his weight or a strategically placed tool to force it open if he felt ignored. I remember taping a "Keep Out" sign to the inside of the door when I was about 10, thinking it was cute. Now, I look at that fading construction paper relic and just feel a profound sense of failure. A decade of growing up, and I still hadn't learned how to truly keep myself safe. When he made the threat that day, I just nodded, mute. What else could I do? My voice felt trapped somewhere behind my tonsils. I watched him, this stranger wearing my brother's face, turn and walk away, leaving the door slightly open, a silent declaration that he could come back any time. I remember slowly sinking onto the edge of my bed, hands trembling so violently I had to grip my knees. My mind was racing, a frantic search engine trying to find a manual on how to survive living with a bully who knows your parents won't step in. The silence after he left was worse than the confrontation. It was the kind of silence that screams expectations. I knew the unspoken rules. If I told Mum and Dad what he said, they would panic. And their panic, unfortunately, was fuel for Mark. He thrived on their fear. If they confronted him directly about the physical threats, he'd just turn that veiled aggression toward them. He had this manipulative way of twisting situations, making them look like the hysterical ones, the ones overreacting to a simple, brotherly disagreement. I recall one incident from a few months prior just to give you context. I had accidentally left my bike leaning against the garage wall when I was supposed to put it away immediately. Nothing major, right? Except Mark saw it. He didn't shout. He walked over, calmly picked up a hammer from the workbench, and methodically began smashing the spokes. I rushed out, screaming for him to stop. Mum and Dad ran out too, and they started pleading, "Mark, stop it! That's not necessary!" And Mark just looked at them, holding the hammer loosely, and said, with this sickeningly reasonable tone, "Relax. It was in the wrong place. Just teaching a lesson about respect for property. You guys are being hysterical." He put the hammer down gently, walked inside, and didn't speak to them for 2 days, giving them the silent treatment until they apologized to him for interrupting his lesson. That was the dynamic. He controlled the temperature of the house through calculated emotional terrorism. So, back in my room, tears blurring the edges of my vision, I didn't cry loudly. I couldn't. Tears were a sign of weakness, and weakness was an invitation for more pain. I stuffed a pillow over my face, trying to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. The thought kept repeating itself. I don't feel safe in my own room. That sentence is a condemnation. It means your fundamental rights as a human being, the right to privacy, the right to physical security, have been revoked by someone living under the same roof. I looked around my room. Everything suddenly felt alien. The poster on the wall, the stack of books, the desk I used for homework, all potential violations of Mark's unspoken code. I started obsessively tidying, not because I cared about neatness, but because I was trying to erase any potential reason for him to come back and enforce his threat. I shoved my laptop under my bed, organized my desk drawers so they were perfectly aligned, and even made my bed with military precision, smoothing the comforter until it looked like polished granite. It was a ritual of submission, a desperate attempt to appease the unpredictable storm. For the next few days, I moved through the house like a ghost. I walked on the balls of my feet, spoke in careful whispers, and anticipated Mark's movements before he even made them. If I heard his car pull into the driveway, I was already retreating to my room, locking the door, and pretending to be asleep, even if it was noon on a Saturday. If he was watching TV in the living room, I'd take the longest, most circuitous route possible to the kitchen, hugging the walls, trying to become invisible. It was exhausting. I was perpetually tense, running on adrenaline and fear. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate. The moment I opened a book, my ears would strain, waiting for the telltale sound of his heavy boots on the stairs. Sleep became a battlefield. I'd often wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard his footsteps outside my door, my body tensing up instantly, ready to either fight or flee, only to realize it was just the house settling. This constant vigilance drains you. It steals your youth, your joy, your sense of self. I was becoming a shell of the person I used to be, all because I was living under the constant threat of severe, unprovoked violence from my own brother, with my parents offering nothing more than worried looks and useless whispered pleas for peace. The situation was unsustainable. It was deteriorating rapidly, and I knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in my stomach, that I had to make a choice soon. A choice that involved risking everything: the fragile peace, my parents' fragile composure, and possibly Mark's reaction, to save myself. Should I call the police? The idea felt enormous, treasonous even, but the alternative was waiting for the day he actually decided to make good on his promise to beat me until I was bloody. Continuing the story, the question, should I call the police, wasn't a simple logistical query. It was a moral and emotional abyss I kept staring into. In my mind, calling the authorities felt like igniting a bomb in our relatively quiet suburban home. I pictured the uniforms at the door, the harsh, fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, the absolute wreckage of my family unit. Mark would undoubtedly play the victim, painting me as the unstable one, the liar trying to ruin his life. And Mom and Dad? Their fear would materialize into something real and visible. They would be devastated, not just by the intervention, but by the knowledge that their child felt so unsafe they had to call strangers for help. Yet the alternative was becoming unbearable. The constant walking on eggshells was grinding away at my sanity. I started having panic attacks, small, sharp intakes of breath that left me dizzy and convinced I was suffocating. I developed this twitch in my left eye that wouldn't go away. I was 12, maybe 13, too young to be analysing the nuances of domestic abuse dynamics, but old enough to know that living in terror wasn't normal. One Tuesday afternoon, the situation escalated past threats and into action, but not directly aimed at me, yet. Mark had decided my mother's newly planted rose bushes were an eyesore. He didn't ask her. He just took a shovel from the shed and began systematically ripping them out of the ground, laughing slightly as he tossed the dirt over the pristine lawn. Mum saw it from the kitchen window. Her face went white, the colour draining away like water down a plug hole. She didn't yell. That was the worst part. She walked out slowly, almost mechanically, and stood near the edge of the yard. "Mark, what are you doing? I just planted those." Mark didn't stop digging. He didn't even look up. "They look ugly here, Mum. They need to go." "Please, stop," she whispered. That whisper, that sound of utter brokenness, finally got his attention. He stopped, slowly lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. In that moment, I saw not just defiance, but contempt. He stood up, wiping his muddy hands on his jeans, and walked right past her, brushing her shoulder slightly as he went. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was dismissive, dominant. Mom flinched, physically recoiling as if struck by a blow, and then she just stood there, staring at the ruined earth, tears finally streaming down her face. I was watching from the upstairs window, clutching the windowsill so tightly my knuckles were white. That was the pivot point for me. Seeing my protector, my mother, rendered powerless and physically dismissed by her own son, solidified something terrifying. No one was coming to save me unless I saved myself. My parents were hostages too, trapped by their own enabling fear and misplaced loyalty. The next day, I needed to access the shared family computer in the den to do some mandatory school research. Mark usually hogs it, but he was out. I crept in, heart pounding, fingers hovering over the mouse. I knew I couldn't just look up how to report a violent brother. That search history would be found. Mark was meticulous about checking everyone's devices. So I opened a blank document, titled it Grocery List, and started typing my real searches in a coded way, hoping that if he glanced at the screen, it would just look like mundane planning. I typed in fragmented queries. Local authorities response domestic violence minor. Can a minor contact child services anonymously? And the one that felt like the ultimate betrayal. How to press charges against sibling physical assault. The information I found was dense, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly vague about what would happen next. Most resources heavily emphasized parental consent or intervention. Without Mum and Dad's cooperation, it felt like I'd be fighting a giant machine with a pea shooter. I spent hours researching shelters, temporary housing options for minors, and legal hotlines. The more I read, the more I realized that contacting the police directly would trigger a full investigation, which meant Mark would know immediately, and the fallout would be explosive. If he thought I was trying to send him to jail, the threats he'd made about my teeth and my face would transition from threats to execution. He wouldn't wait for the police. He would act first, seeking retribution. I retreated back to my room, the grocery list document minimized on the desktop, feeling physically sick from the weight of the secret I was now carrying. I had to know if my parents could be brought on board, but the risk of approaching them with the idea of calling the police was astronomical. They might panic and blurt it out in front of Mark, or worse, they might try to mediate one last time, giving Mark the heads up he needed to prepare his defense or his retribution plan. That evening, Dad was watching the news in the living room, and Mum was quietly folding laundry nearby. This was my only chance, a small window when Mark was at his friend Alex's house, supposedly studying. I walked into the living room, deliberately not hovering near the doorway, but approaching the couch slowly. "Dad? Mum? Can I talk to you both for a minute? Seriously?" My voice sounded high and tight, like a violin string about to snap. They both looked up, immediately registering the gravity in my tone. Dad muted the TV, a significant gesture, usually reserved for important phone calls. I sat down on the floor in front of them, wrapping my arms around my legs, trying to appear small and non-threatening, yet firm. I know you guys try to keep the peace, and I know you're scared of what Mark might do if you push him. I get it. But things have gotten past the point where ignoring it works. Mum stopped folding the towel in her hands. Her eyes were already brimming. What is it, honey? Did he say something else? I took a deep breath, letting the facade drop. I didn't need to recount the threat about my teeth. That was already implied by the atmosphere. I needed to focus on the safety issue. Mum, Dad, I can't live like this anymore. I am genuinely afraid to be in my own room. He threatened me with serious, life-altering physical harm. And I saw how you reacted to the roses, Dad. You were scared of him. You too are scared of your own son. I watched their faces, trying to gauge their reaction. Dad looked ashamed, his jaw tight. Mum looked like she was about to cry for the 1,000th time. We know he's out of line, sweetheart, Dad started, his voice thick. We'll talk to him. No! I cut him off, louder than I intended. The sound startled the cat asleep nearby. Talking doesn't work. That's why I'm sitting here. Talking is what got us to the point where I feel safer making a plan to run away than staying here. Mum gasped, clutching the laundry basket. Run away? No, absolutely not. We won't let you do that. We are your parents. We will handle this. How? I challenged them, my voice cracking with desperation. How will you handle it? Will you tell him to stop? Because if you tell him to stop, he'll just get angrier, and then he'll turn that anger onto you, just like you saw with the roses. He's too big, too strong, and he is completely unrestrained by any rules. He has made it so no one feels safe around him, not even you two. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to the same conspiratorial whisper Mark used. But this was for solidarity, not intimidation. I was looking up resources. If we call the police, it's immediate intervention. They take physical threats seriously. But if we do that, Mark will know it was my last resort, and he will retaliate before they even get here. I need to know, if I decide to call, will you back me up? Will you tell the police exactly what he said he would do to me? Will you stand by me even if he explodes? The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Dad looked at the floor, wrestling with his paternal duty versus his instinct for self-preservation. Mum looked at me, her eyes wide with a deep, terrified love. They were facing the horrifying realization that their strategy of appeasement had bred a monster, and now, confronting that monster meant potential catastrophe. The weight of their silence pressed down on me, heavier than any physical blow Mark could deliver. It was the silence of capitulation, the sound of two people realizing they had lost control of their own family, and the subsequent fear of admitting that loss out loud. Dad finally cleared his throat, running a hand over his thinning hair. He looked defeated. If you call the police, we will support you, honey. We have to. We can't let him hurt you. His voice was strained, laced with a deep undertone of regret. It was the first concrete promise of defense I had heard, but it sounded like it was extracted under duress, not offered freely. Mum rushed over then, kneeling beside me, pulling me into a tight hug that smelled faintly of fabric softener and panic. We love you more than anything, she murmured into my hair. If it comes to that, we will tell them everything. We promise. But promises made in moments of crisis often dissolve under pressure. I looked past her shoulder at Dad. His eyes were fixed on the front door, a nervous tick I hadn't noticed before. He wasn't thinking about justice or safety. He was thinking about Mark walking through that door and the scene that would unfold. I knew I had planted the seed, but I couldn't rely solely on their fractured courage. The decision to call the police, or any official body, had to be mine, executed preemptively, before Mark detected the shift in the atmosphere or noticed their sudden, forced unity. For the next few days, I lived in a state of heightened alert, pretending everything was normal while secretly making contingency plans. I started sleeping with my phone under my pillow, not just on the nightstand. I downloaded an anonymous reporting app that allowed for non-emergency contact, just in case I needed to feel out the process without immediate dispatch. The climax arrived with shocking mundanity. It was a Friday night. Mark was supposed to be at Alex's until late, but he came home early, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the pictures in the hallway. I was in my room, doing my homework, ostensibly, but really listening. I heard him stomp into the kitchen, grab a soda, and then the sound of heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. My breath hitched. He knows. I didn't know how, but the intent in his footsteps was different tonight. It wasn't annoyance. It was hunting. I scrambled off the bed. My mind went blank for a crucial second. Fight? Flight? Hide? Flight was impossible. He'd cut me off before I reached the hall. Hiding was useless. He knew every nook in this house. I grabbed my phone, my hand slick with sweat, and fumbled with the screen lock. As the deadbolt clicked on my door, a sound that usually brought momentary relief, this time it sounded like a death knell, sealing me in with my own fear. A heavy, rhythmic pounding started on the wood, instantly recognizable. Thump, thump, thump. Not frantic, but measured. Powerful. "Open the door, you little worm!" Mark's voice, amplified by the door, was guttural, stripped of any pretense of kinship. "I know you've been talking behind my back. I can smell the betrayal." I didn't answer. I pressed my back against the wall opposite the door, tears finally spilling over, hot and useless. My fingers found the contact on my phone screen, a local non-emergency line I'd noted down. The one that promised discretion. "Don't call the police yet," my panicked brain screamed. "He'll hear you dialing and he'll break the door down immediately." I opened the anonymous reporting app instead. I selected the option for immediate threat of physical harm and started typing a short, urgent message, my thumbs flying across the screen in a desperate blur. "My brother is threatening extreme violence, refusing to let me leave my room. Threat involves teeth and broken bones. I need someone here discreetly before he breaches the door. Address? Our address." I hit send. The confirmation message flashed. "Report received. A unit is en route." The pounding intensified. The frame of the door actually began to creak inward under the pressure. Mark must have realized he wasn't getting a response, and his restraint evaporated. "Fine. You want to play games? I'll play," he roared. I heard a crash. He must have stepped back to use momentum. I braced myself against the wall, shutting my eyes, preparing for the wood to splinter. The internal monologue was a frantic plea. "Hurry, please, hurry!" And then, just as the wood around the doorknob began to give way with a sharp, tearing sound, another sound cut through the night. A distinct, unfamiliar sound. The wail of a distant siren, growing rapidly closer. Mark froze. The pounding stopped mid-swing. I held my breath, listening to the approaching sound, which was now undeniably a police cruiser, slowing down right outside our house. Mark knew what that meant. Even if he'd never faced legal repercussions, the presence of uniformed authority was a massive deterrent to his carefully curated dominance. There was a heavy silence on the other side of the door. Mark wasn't just confused. He was calculating, his mind moving at lightning speed to assess the damage. Then I heard him retreat, not running, but stomping heavily down the stairs, his movements calculated to sound loud and angry, but decisively away from my door. I heard the back door open and slam shut with incredible force. He was fleeing the scene before they could even knock. I stayed glued to the wall, phone still clutched, listening. The siren noise faded slightly as the car parked. Then, the sharp, authoritative rapping on the front door. "Police! Open up!" My parents' voices sounded shaky, high-pitched, echoing up the stairwell. "Officer, please, we're coming!" I stayed put, frozen. I had done it. I had pulled the lever. But now I was alone, waiting for the aftermath, the interrogation, the fallout. Would my parents tell the truth? Would they try to cover for him, saying it was a misunderstanding, thereby exposing me as the liar who called the cops on her own brother? I heard them open the front door. Muffled voices descended into hushed tones, then slightly louder as the officers entered the hallway. I could hear my dad stammering. It was just a loud argument. My son, he has a temper." My heart sank. He was already minimizing it. He was already protecting Mark's reputation over my safety. I pushed myself away from the wall, my legs shaky. I had to intervene before the narrative solidified around a lie. If the police left believing this was just a temper issue, Mark would return emboldened, knowing he could get away with anything short of a direct witnessing. I unlocked my door, the sound of the latch clicking seeming deafening in the tense house. I stepped out into the landing, looking down at the scene. 2 officers stood patiently in the hallway, Dad looking pale and apologetic, Mum weeping softly while leaning against the banister. I walked down the stairs, trying to project a calm I absolutely did not feel. I made sure my posture was straight, my eyes clear. I was no longer the trembling victim from an hour ago. I was the witness, the reporter, the person who knew exactly what was happening. "Officers," I said, my voice startlingly clear, cutting through my parents' anxious murmurs. My brother, Mark, just threatened to beat me until I was bloody and punch my teeth down my throat if I didn't comply with his demands. He tried to break down my locked door just moments ago. He is gone now, but he will be back." I met the gaze of the taller officer, holding his eyes steadily. "I am not safe here. I need to report this assault and the ongoing threats. My parents tried to handle it internally, but it hasn't worked. I need your help now." The atmosphere in the hallway immediately shifted. The officers stopped looking sympathetically at my parents and focused entirely on me. My calm recitation of the facts, contrasting sharply with my parents' distress, painted a stark picture. The taller officer, whose name tag read Officer Miller, nodded slowly, his professional demeanour hardening. "Thank you for telling us clearly, young lady. Can you show us the damage to your door?" As I led them back upstairs, I risked a glance at my parents. Dad looked devastated, recognising that the line had officially been crossed. Mum was just staring at the spot where Mark had stood, perhaps finally understanding the true extent of the danger we lived under. I felt a pang of guilt for forcing their hand, but it was instantly drowned out by the feeling of a pressure valve finally releasing. Officer Miller examined the cracked door frame and the splintered wood around the lock. He took photos. He asked direct, pointed questions about the specific threats, ignoring my parents' attempts to interject with mitigating statements like, "He didn't mean all of it," or "He's just stressed from school." When they asked about previous incidents, I recounted the story of the smashed bicycle. But this time, I added the detail about Mark's reaction to Mum and Dad's plea, the dismissive contempt, the subsequent silent treatment. I painted a picture not of a troubled kid, but of a calculated abuser who understood how to manipulate the household's emotional levers. The process was grueling. It took hours. The officers took detailed statements. They explained the next steps, filing an official report, initiating a welfare check on Mark if he didn't return, and advising my parents on obtaining a temporary restraining order, something they hadn't even known was an option until that moment. When the police finally left, the house was eerily silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of fear. It was the stunned quiet after an earthquake. My parents retreated to the living room, talking in low, panicked whispers, clearly reeling from the legal reality that had just crashed into their home. I returned to my room. The door was a mess, a gaping wound in the wall, but I didn't bother trying to lock it. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the desperate need to secure myself inside. The threat was now externalized, acknowledged by the outside world. Mark was now a fugitive from the law. Temporarily, I sat on my bed, staring at the broken wood, and allowed myself the first, honest, uncontrolled cry of release. It was terrifying, yes. My life was about to become incredibly complicated, messy, and likely confrontational. But in that moment, looking at the wreckage of my door, I realized something profound. I hadn't waited for salvation. I had activated it. The hardest part remained, waiting for Mark to return, or for the consequences of his flight to catch up to him. I knew he wouldn't come back quietly, and I knew the threats were still hanging in the air, just waiting for an audience of two to disappear before they were in force. The waiting was an exquisite form of torture. The adrenaline that had fueled my actions during the police visit began to drain away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion mixed with raw, exposed nerves. I knew Mark was gone, but gone in our small town didn't mean vanished forever. It meant he was hiding, sulking, or actively planning his next move, armed with the knowledge that I had betrayed the unspoken code of silence, and worse, involved the authorities. Mum and Dad were in a state of suspended animation downstairs. I could hear the sporadic, anxious movement, a pacing sound, a door opening and closing, but no sustained conversation. They were terrified of Mark returning, terrified of the police showing up again, and terrified of the chasm that had suddenly opened between them and me, the chasm of agency. I had acted decisively. They had reacted passively. Around midnight, Dad tentatively knocked on my doorframe, stepping just inside the room, careful not to touch the damaged door. He looked 10 years older than he had that afternoon. "He's not back," Dad whispered, as if announcing it too loudly would summon Mark. "We called Alex's parents. Mark hasn't been there since around 6 p.m. They haven't seen him." "He knows," I murmured, hugging my knees to my chest. "He knows I called. He probably ran when he heard the sirens," Dad said, trying to inject some logic into the chaos. "Look, we need to decide what we tell the police when they follow up tomorrow. If you press charges, we need to support that. But if we say we didn't want to press charges..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the disastrous consequence of backtracking now. "We don't backtrack," I said firmly, feeling a strange surge of adult resolve. "If we lie now, we tell Mark that we will always choose his comfort over my safety. We told them what he did. We have to stand by the truth we told them." Dad nodded slowly, a painful acknowledgement of the path we were now forced onto. "Okay, we stand by it, but we need to talk about what happens if he comes back here angry. He won't be scared of us anymore, not after this. He'll only see you as the catalyst for his trouble." That conversation was the hardest part of the aftermath. It wasn't about Mark's anger. It was about accepting that my relationship with my brother was irrevocably broken. The possibility of reconciliation, of him simply snapping out of it, vanished the moment the police cruiser pulled up. I had initiated a formal process against him. He was no longer just a bad brother. He was a potential defendant. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I stayed in my room, the broken door serving as a strange monument to my decision. I checked my phone obsessively. No messages from Mark, no calls, nothing. Around noon, Officer Miller and a female partner returned for a follow-up. They were professional, calm, and didn't look at my parents with pity, which helped. They spoke directly to me. They confirmed that an APB, All Points Bulletin, had been issued for Mark for questioning regarding the threats and property damage, classifying it as a domestic dispute escalation. Mum and Dad were forced to confirm their statements under less emotional duress. They admitted they had minimized the situation initially out of fear, but affirmed that the threats had been made and that they believed I was in danger. This was crucial. Their confirmation meant the case wouldn't immediately be dropped due to parental interference. "We are going to advise you on a protection order tomorrow," Officer Miller told me. "It means if he comes within a certain distance of this residence or contacts you in any way, he can be immediately arrested. That was the lifeline I needed. A legal barrier. The officers left, and the house settled back into a nervous hum. My parents were visibly shaken but resolute, at least for the moment. They had crossed the Rubicon with me. Then, late that afternoon, the tension snapped. I was downstairs making a sandwich, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, when the front window rattled violently. Not a siren, not a door slam, but a heavy, deliberate thud against the glass. I spun around. Standing on the lawn, about 20 feet away, was Mark. He wasn't hiding. He was making a statement. He looked wild, his hair unkempt, his clothes rumpled, like he'd been sleeping rough. He was staring directly at the window where I stood. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but holding up something small and dark. It took me a second to realize what it was. One of my front teeth. My blood turned to slush. One of my teeth? That level of brutality, that intimate knowledge of inflicting specific, targeted pain, it was beyond anything I had imagined. He must have found an old retainer or some discarded object, or maybe it was a gruesome, terrifying bluff. But in that moment, seeing that small, white object held up like a trophy, I believed every word of his initial threat. He wasn't just threatening, he was demonstrating his capacity. Panic seized me so completely that I couldn't move, couldn't scream. From the kitchen I heard my mother scream, a high, ragged sound of pure terror. Dad bolted toward the front door. Mark saw Dad moving and he didn't wait. He turned and bolted toward the side of the house, disappearing behind the overgrown lilac bushes that bordered our property. Dad flung the door open, scanning the street wildly. "Mark, get back here!" "Did you see him?" I finally managed to choke out, rushing to the door, leaning past my father. "He was here," Dad panted, his chest heaving. He had something in his hand. He ran. Mum was hyperventilating, clutching her chest. "He's going to come back. He knows we called. He's insane!" The brief reprieve was over. Mark hadn't just fled the police. He had returned to issue a direct, terrifying retaliation, using a symbol of violence, the tooth, to show me the consequences of my actions. Dad, galvanized by Mom's terror and the visual evidence of Mark's reappearance, finally seemed to shed his paralysis. He turned to me, his face set. "Call them back. Now. Tell them he was here. Tell them he threatened you again." I grabbed my phone, my fingers surprisingly steady now that the action required was clear. I didn't use the anonymous app this time. I called the main dispatch number directly, my voice projecting across the stunned silence of the house. 911? This is an emergency. My brother, Mark, who has an active threat warrant out for him, just returned to the property. He displayed a disturbing object intended to intimidate me, and he fled again. I need an immediate unit back here. He is escalating. This time the response was fast. Within 5 minutes, the flashing blue and red lights washed over our living room walls. The officers were different this time, more focused, treating the situation with the urgency it finally demanded. They took detailed reports of Mark's reappearance and the object he displayed. They confirmed that because he had violated the implicit expectation of non-harassment while they were investigating, the situation was now significantly more serious. They told my parents they needed to file for an emergency protective order immediately, and they strongly suggested that Mark be picked up for questioning if he was located. My parents, seeing the police treat this with full seriousness, finally broke. They stopped trying to manage Mark's reputation and started focusing solely on my immediate safety. They signed every piece of paper required for the emergency order. The crucial difference now was that I wasn't the only one making the decision. My parents were now fully invested in maintaining the boundary I had drawn. They had seen Mark's face, and they had seen the terror he could inflict on their family in real time. That night, I slept in a guest room downstairs, feeling slightly safer but fundamentally changed. I was now officially involved in a legal conflict with my brother. There was no going back to the status quo. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, whispered phone calls, and the agonizing wait for Mark to surface. The house felt empty, tainted by the constant awareness of his absence and the potential for his return. My focus narrowed entirely to school and survival. I didn't talk to my friends much. I couldn't articulate the seismic shift that had occurred in my life. How do you casually mention that your brother is a fugitive because he threatened to punch your teeth down your throat? About a week later, the phone rang. It was Officer Miller. "We located Mark," he said, his voice flat. "He was picked up at a transit station about 50 miles from here, trying to board a long-distance bus. He resisted initially, but we took him into custody." The tension in the house evaporated, replaced by a wave of exhausted relief. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was space. It was breathable air. Mark was being held. The emergency protective order was in place. He was legally barred from returning home or contacting me. The following week was dedicated to the hearing for the permanent restraining order. My parents and I sat in the sterile courtroom, waiting for Mark to be brought in. When he was escorted in, shackled, he looked smaller, stripped of his home field advantage. His eyes scanned the room, found me, and locked on. There was no rage this time, only a deep, simmering hatred mixed with disbelief. He couldn't believe he had been caught, contained. When it was my turn to testify, I was terrified. But I spoke clearly, recounting the timeline, the initial threat, the control, the smashed roses, the return with the object. I kept my voice steady, focusing on facts and the tangible fear, not just the emotion. When my father testified, he was perhaps the most moving witness. He didn't try to defend Mark or excuse his behaviour. He simply said, looking directly at the judge, "I failed to protect my children. My son became a danger in his own home. We need this order enforced so that my other child can feel safe in their own bedroom again. We are done trying to manage this. We need the law to step in." Mark's court-appointed lawyer tried to paint me as overly dramatic, implying teenage rivalry. But the photos of the door and the confirmed police reports from the initial call made those arguments crumble. The judge ruled in our favour. A permanent restraining order was granted, mandating Mark stay away from the house and from all of us for a significant period, pending further criminal proceedings for the threats made. Mark was released into the custody of distant relatives under strict conditions pending further hearings, effectively banned from our lives for the foreseeable future. As we walked out of the courthouse, the sun seemed brighter than it had in months. It wasn't over. There would be counselling, there would be therapy, there would be the long, awkward process of rebuilding trust with my parents, who now had to confront their own enabling behaviour. But the immediate physical threat was gone. I looked down at my hands. They weren't trembling anymore. I had faced the monster that lived in my house, the one I thought was untouchable, and I had used the systems designed to protect people, even if those systems required a terrifying leap of faith to engage. It was the hardest, scariest thing I have ever done, but it brought me back my room, my peace, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to be a normal teenager again. If you've ever been in a situation where the people meant to protect you are too scared to act, you understand the impossible choice. Silence and suffering, or speaking up and risking explosion. What would you have done when that threat about your teeth became horrifyingly real? Let me know in the comments below. And if stories about finding the courage to break destructive cycles resonate with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next story where we explore the long road to healing after trauma.